finish doing your input, Ollie. So thanks, I'll hand it over.
Okay, thanks, Deirdre. So Deirdre has given me 5 minutes, and I'm going to try and cover 5 points in this 5 minutes. And the purpose of them is just to stimulate some discussion for the breakout rooms. So we have some questions to consider from the brochure, but I want to bring in 5 points that kind of intersect these questions. The first one is focusing on informal learning opportunities. And as an educator, we know that learning doesn't necessarily take place just in the formal lecture spaces or the tutorials or workshops. They often take place in between the cracks of normal formal learning experiences. The coffee chats, for example, after the lecture, where you sit down and admit to your friends that you hadn't a clue what the lecturer was talking about. And then that person, your friend, might explain what they meant, and suddenly you learn in that way. So these informal learning experiences play a really important function in the social construction of knowledge amongst student teachers. And as teacher educators, in responding to this pandemic, we've all been focusing on delivery of formal lectures or tutorials or seminars online without really paying attention to the less formal and informal engagement that students have or used to have on campus, because they're becoming increasingly isolated from their peers as they move towards online learning. So the first question I want to raise there is, can we as teacher educators facilitate this informal interaction beyond the more formal sessions we're required and mandated to teach in our roles as teacher educators? The second point that's worth thinking about is our bubbles that we live in. So in an online space, as we're moving towards more online space, we determine who we meet, what we read, what we see, and this can result in what's known as a digital echo chamber. And a digital echo chamber is where the algorithms used by different types of software will keep sending us similar material. So if you think of your Twitter account, how many challenging perspectives that challenge your worldview do you receive from your Twitter account? If you think of your use of the likes of Spotify or YouTube to listen to music, how many times does it offer a piece of music that's outside of your own music tastes? So as we move towards this online environment, we have to consider that students themselves are in digital echo chambers. There are filter bubbles caused by these powerful algorithms that students use, or that are used to shape their experience of the world. And our circle of friends and our circle of acquaintances and even wider contexts are being minimized in this online space because we're not bumping into people that perhaps have different alternative views than ourselves. And how do we then as teacher educators try and minimize the effect of these digital echo chambers that students are being increasingly sucked into because most of their interaction is now on an online space? Third point that I want to move on to is the idea of technology as an amplifier. The emeritus professor from Stanford, Harvard, Larry Cuban, talks about technology as an amplifier, in that it tends to amplify what we do already. And so if we think about our own assumptions around teaching and learning, and as we move towards more online or blended learning, what are we using this technology to amplify? And sometimes it can be amplifying very, very good practices, but sometimes it can be amplifying very, very poor practices. And doesn't this give us an opportunity to stand back and question some of the assumptions we have about existing practices? And another question we need to think about as teacher educators as we move towards this online space is, how comfortable are we as teacher educators in this online space? And how does this challenge our own identities as teacher educators? Fourth point is around the idea of self-regulated learning skills. And what I mean by that is the idea that we think and we assume that students can move into this online space and work readily in it. And the research indicates that actually self-regulated learning skills are skills that have to be learned. There's 3 components to it. I won't go into the details of that, but we often assume that students have the skills, the self-regulated learning skills to learn this online environment, and indeed that they have access to appropriate technology, they have access to a place to study, they're not in a crowded kind of household where they can't engage in that. So there's issues outside of the control of the teacher educator, but certainly in relation to developing self-regulated learning skills, how should we as teacher educators, try and integrate the development of self-regulated learning skills into the student experience over the next number of years so they can actually get the best out of this online transition. And the final point I want to make is the idea of professional digital competence. And we know that one of the key goals of teacher education globally is to ensure that student teachers have a good understanding of digital technologies and can use it effectively and wisely in their practice. And that whole area is known as professional digital competence. And one of those aspects is related to cyber ethics. So we have a huge opportunity as teacher educators now to help educate students around cyber ethics and broader issues of professional digital competence. The concern that I have is that in our rush to move towards an online space, what many students are experiencing as technology enhanced learning experiences are quite poor because a lot of our institutions don't have experience and a history of using these digital technologies. So what becomes a norm may not necessarily be educationally effective. So they're the 5 points I wanted to talk about. One is the idea of the informal learning experiences. What about the informal learning experiences? The second relates to the idea of digital echo chambers. How do we get students out of digital echo chambers? Third is, what are we amplifying and what does that tell us about our practice? Fourth relates to the idea of self-regulated learning skills. And then the fifth relates to the idea of professional digital competence. So I thought there might be some good ideas to throw into the conversation